All right, I think we're gonna get started. So if you're still getting food, feel free. If you want more food at any point in this, please feel free to get up and get more. We don't want to waste food. A lot of what we're going to talk about today relates to how important it is to take care of the environment and think about the component of food within that. So let's not waste it. I'm really excited today. I'm going to make two introductions actually. First, I'm going to introduce a little boy who's sitting over there. What are you looking at? We're all looking at you. This is Fletcher Lieb. He's a very important participant in today's activity. And to help us remember what we're all here to talk about, he's drawn a picture of the Earth. So hopefully Fletcher will quietly join in the conversation today. And more importantly, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, which we're really excited to welcome Peter Lehner, who now directs the Earthjustice Sustainable Food and Farming Program, which is working on strategies to reduce health, environmental, and climate harms from the production of food. And he previously was the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council. He was also the chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. He's had a very long and distinguished career in environmental law and is really well known in this, and in the past few years has really gotten into the impacts of the food and farming system on the environment, and that's why he built this new program at Earthjustice. So it's been amazing to collaborate over the years, first in his position at NRDC and then now with Earthjustice. I think his message is really important. The work he's done as an attorney it's definitely inspired me and should be inspiring to all of you as to what you can do in your own careers. And not even in your careers, what you can do now as students. What are the important things to be thinking about, researching, and developing solutions to? And he's really just very, very respected and well known as a leading practitioner and also scholar in climate and ag policy. I want to also briefly thank Nate Rosenberg, who's in the back, who is an alum. He graduated from HLS in 2011 and also started the Food Law Society here at Harvard Law School as a student, and we've worked together for some time. So Peter and Nate are collaborating on a book that's going to be about climate change policy in agriculture that I think is coming next year, hopefully, which is great. And Nate organized this event and then the event this evening. So at 5:30, we're going to be in this building in room 1023 talking about the Green New Deal and the future of food with some other panelists. And lastly, just to our co-sponsors, Food Law Society, Environmental Law Society, and the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. And then I direct the Food Law and Policy Clinic. So thank you to everyone and welcome to Peter.
Thanks, Nate, and thank all of you for being here. I saw the list there. It seemed like a dozen other lunch talks, let alone lunch. So you could be many other places. So I'm going to be trying to talk about the intersection of climate and agriculture. And just to sort of give a bit of an intro to that, I've been working in climate change issues for a long, long time. I brought a case as far back as 1988 challenging climate change impacts of one of President Reagan's rollbacks. The rollbacks that Trump is doing, by the way, have a long legacy of prior presidential rollbacks. But for the vast majority of that time, the focus has, of course, been on energy. But over the years, I started realizing the enormous and outsized impact of agriculture as well on the climate. And of course, agriculture is more affected by climate change than virtually any other sector of the economy. I also, because it was not just climate, but a whole range of environmental issues I dealt with, realized that agriculture is one of the largest drivers of water pollution and our public health challenges. And yet, one year when I was doing the budget at NRDC, I realized we spent less than 1% of our budget, our entire budget at that time was over 100 million, on anything relating to food and agriculture. So I thought that's sort of crazy. So I started building the program up there, and that's why I'm focusing on it now. I'm also focusing on it because separate from my advocacy hat, through my family, I actually manage a couple farms down in Costa Rica, a cane farm and a coffee farm. And as I was essentially being a prosecutor, sometimes suing farms in this country, I was also trying to run farms down in Central America. and learning what it meant to run a farm well. And over the years, we've transformed the coffee farm, so it's been certified. It was the first farm in the world to have the farm and the processing plant be certified as carbon neutral. And all of these changes, which is fundamental for advocacy, have not only been environmentally successful, but actually somewhat profitable. And our cane farm which produces also clean energy, clean electricity, and biofuels as a byproduct, as well as organic fancy sugar cane, if you ever get that sugar in the raw stuff, is also considered the greenest farm in Central America. So I say that because much of what I'll be talking about, going through some of the harms of agriculture, are real, but the possibility of transformation is also real. And I know how hard it is. I had to convince first my family that I wasn't just a tree-hugging nut and I was going to lose all their money. But it actually is possible, and the results are pretty astounding. So I came to this from these two different directions, the advocacy and the practical, and now I'm focusing on that. So agriculture is what you see when you look out the window. If you fly across the country and you look out, you see farms. You don't see pretty much the rest of human activity. This is a Bloomberg map, which is really pretty great. It gives you an idea. All of that is cattle range. This is at livestock feed, roughly speaking, the size of Texas in a different shape. But if you look at this, you see that it's agriculture which drives land use in this country. And it is also, of course, what produces our food, which at this point is a vast amount of cheap food. It's cheaper than it's ever been. And we're also producing a lot more than we need, which in part contributes to why, as Emily mentioned, we waste 40% of our food and there's an obesity epidemic. And yet at the same time, 1 out of 7 Americans are food insecure, and there actually is a lot of still food insecurity all around the world. So you've got this weird situation, we're producing too much, but also people aren't having enough. We've got a growing population, huge regional disparities. Our food system really isn't working the way we would like it to work. I'm going to go relatively quickly, as I said, through some of the harms of industrial agriculture, so we can spend more time on some of the ways we can address it. But if people want to ask questions or jump in at any time, feel free, because I recognize we don't have all that much time. First to point out is when we talk about the impacts of agriculture, in a very real way, the impacts of agriculture are the impacts of meat. Most of about at least half of our cropland is actually not used to grow food that you eat directly. It's used to grow food that animals eat. And that's often really inefficient. It takes, and Nate and I talked about this in our chapter in a forthcoming book, it takes about 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. That's like driving an SUV that gets 2 miles a gallon. Other animals like pork and chicken are a little more efficient, but still it's a vast, inefficient use of a tremendous amount of our crops. And then the animals themselves are now producing a prodigious amount of waste, 50 times the amount of waste that humans produce. And if any of you are taking the environmental law, one of the things you study is the Clean Water Act, which really, I think, is one of the achievements of human civilization. I mean, it's a great statute and in many ways has done just enormous amounts of good, in many ways is quite effective. But it largely exempts agriculture. But you have this weird situation that we spent hundreds of billions of dollars to deal with human waste, which is a good thing. Poop in the waterways isn't good. But now we're producing 50 times that much waste, and we're spending virtually nothing to treat it. And our waterways are showing the result. So it's also, if you study environmental law, you'll probably remember, we're fighting about wolves and wolf delisting. A group like NRDC or Earthjustice has just endless cases trying to protect wolves and bears. Those actually are agriculture cases. The reason we are fighting is because ranching, largely, has been pushed into habitat and territory for bears and wolves, and bears and wolves are acting like bears and wolves. And so that is the conflict that is leading to these otherwise you think of as Endangered Species Act cases. One of the challenges we're seeing now is its impact on drinking water. Drinking water suppliers around the country are recognizing that they're having to spend more money, and sometimes they can't do anything, no matter how much money they spend, to provide clean drinking water. I worked for the city of New York for a long time, and among other things, started the environmental division there. And one of our projects was protecting our drinking water supply, which you may know comes from upstate New York. Well, New York City people call it upstate New York. Upstate people don't call it upstate. But in any event, it comes from a series of reservoirs in the Catskill Mountains and the Delaware River Valley. And what was interesting as I started bringing enforcement cases to try to protect the tributaries is that there was a sewage treatment plant that was discharging inadequately treated, but treated, human sewage into a tributary of a reservoir of the water supply. I could bring a Clean Water Act citizen suit against that facility. And, not everyone was happy, but the politics were okay and the law was pretty good. If meanwhile, 2 miles away from that was a farm with cows standing in the stream, and one dairy cow produces about as much waste as maybe 400 people, that I did not have either the law that would allow me to challenge that farmer's actions, and the politics were even worse. It was somehow okay to fight and litigate about human sewage, but not animal waste. And that is now happening all around the country. You may have read about Toledo actually having to turn off its water supply for a couple days because of algae. And this algae is toxic. It's not just ugly or bad tasting. A guy, Bill Stowe, who famously brought a case on behalf of the city of Des Moines against upstate Iowa dischargers, just died a couple days ago. But it was in a conservative area, Des Moines bringing a challenge against just having to spend more money to provide clean drinking water to its residents. And now you'll be glad to know that your diet is worse for you than smoking. In the United States now, diet-related disease exceeds smoking-related disease. And it's a whole panoply of issues that you've probably heard of, so many of which are related. And some of this is related to nasty chemicals that are put into processed foods or packaging that leaches into your food. And some of it is just because we're eating too much sugar, salt, meat, etc. And antibiotics, by the way, leading to antibiotic resistance, but that's a whole nother story. And then there's our friends, the toxic pesticides. You may know there's a big effort. There's been litigation for a long, long time that we've been involved with, as and others, to try to get EPA to ban at least one of the worst chemicals. But as an example, it's a good story. Chlorpyrifos is an organophosphate pesticide derived from World War II nerve gases. And in 2000, EPA, after pressure, banned it for residential use. So they recognized it was unsafe in our homes, but decided it was okay to stay on our food. So after more litigation, EPA finally did a risk assessment and found that in all uses that were allowed, when you study a pesticide, you look at sort of a use and a crop. So one chemical has 140 approved uses. All 140 uses left residues that were unsafe. So their scientists recommended a complete ban of it. Trump got elected, Pruitt ignored the scientists, so we're back in court. And many states, including New York, I don't think Massachusetts now, but New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Oregon, California, Maryland, and Washington were working on state-level bans. And then lastly, if you just think about the dinner or lunch that you're having now, the breakfast you have, your food is probably about the most international thing in your daily life. Your electricity comes probably from oil and gas nearby. A lot of the building materials maybe from nearby. A lot is probably made in China, but your food came from a dozen different states. If you just think where the milk might have come from, if you had morning berries, or if you had oatmeal from the Midwest, if you had a cup of coffee that was grown somewhere in the tropics. It's a very international system. So that means dealing with it is particularly complicated because you can't just say, let's just fix our home. And it's not only the goods that cross lines, but also the practices. I can promise you from my own experience in Central America that US agricultural practices loom very large in thinking of how things are going to be done in Central America, in part because we're competing, in part because it's the same fertilizer companies, we buy used machinery from US facilities or operations. So what happens in the US eventually becomes the dominant global model. And as I said, we use a lot of land for other things other than healthy food. There's going to be a lot of debate, if you follow it, on biofuels right now. The federal government just agreed to up the level of ethanol in our fuel system, which the oil companies don't particularly like, but you can see sort of as biofuels have increased, a related food index has, because you're now using an area, as this earlier slide showed, the size of Iowa for biofuels. That is land that could have gone to grow food that people eat instead. So there's a significant overlap. And again, as bad as this conflict is in this country, it's even worse in other countries. And then we throw out a lot of it. Hopefully you won't today at lunch. Okay, I'm going to focus for a little bit on climate change because, again, when you think about climate change, you're all used to thinking about coal-fired power plants. When you burn a lump of coal or natural gas, CO2 comes out. So you think basically climate change is CO2. That's not the case with agriculture. With agriculture, it is largely methane, which comes from cows belching and other activities and their waste. It's actually about equivalent to that of the whole oil and gas sector. And yet it's interesting, even a president as aggressive and progressive as Obama, and he moved to have a limit on oil and gas methane emissions, didn't dare to touch agricultural methane emissions because of the political challenge, as well as some practical issues, but the practical issues are not as significant as people think. There are also nitrous oxide emissions, a greenhouse gas about 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And this largely comes from fertilizer that is applied but isn't taken up by the plant. And some of that runs off into the water, pollutes drinking water supplies, cause the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, but some through microbial action becomes nitrous oxide. At our coffee farm, for example, 86% of our greenhouse gas emissions were from over-fertilization. And we have been very careful trying not to over-fertilize and doing a lot of analysis and have a lot of study done. But if you're a farmer's instinct is to say, just in case things go right, let's put on some fertilizer. And you can't put it on every day because of labor costs. So you put on a little bit or you put on too much, and some of it runs off and some of it runs up. You also obviously have there's a fair amount of farm machinery and the like. It's a fairly energy intensive industry. And then when you dig up soil, actually there's more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere. And it's great when it's in there, it creates healthy soils. On the other hand, if you dig it up, the oxygen in the air mixes with the carbon in the soil and becomes carbon dioxide. And so we have, because of the biofuel mandate, just since it was passed in 2007, we've lost millions of acres of land, which supposedly wasn't going to happen, so we're in litigation over that. But that loss of just carbon in that soil is a significant greenhouse gas impact. But as I said, and I can tell you this again from personal experience, climate change is very real from the farmer perspective. In Costa Rica and in all of Central America, because of climate change, we had pests come in like the coffee rust, a fungus, which reduced the crop of coffee for all of Central America by about 30% for a couple of years until we figured out what to do about it. Unfortunately, what to do about it is we're spraying fungicides, we're slowly replanting with resistant varieties, But since a tree lasts 30 years, you can't replant all at once. It takes a long time. We're also seeing at our other farm, weather patterns, which used to be quite stable, a dry season, a wet season, are completely gone. We have, between hurricanes and droughts and others, we have the regional productivity in the whole area, it's not just us, has gone down significantly because the rains just don't come the way they used to. So this is very real, and even though farmers in this country tend to be conservative, tend to be Republican, tend not to talk about climate change, they are seeing it. It's quite real. The losses, if you look at, say, corn yields and profits, every dip is due to extreme weather. And obviously, you think about the floods that's been in the Midwest this year, those are going to be pretty significant impacts on farmers and on all of you because of the federal crop insurance. And one of the challenges, though, of dealing with this is, unlike burning a lump of coal, where you burn a lump of coal, okay, you may have a slightly different, a pulverized coal system or fluidized bed coal system, and you may put different gizmos on your smokestack. Burning a lump of coal is burning a lump of coal. Agriculture is incredibly varied throughout the U.S. If you think dairy in New York, or if you think, as I said, California vegetables, or any of these are very different. They're all lumped under the term agriculture, but they're really quite different. So to have a regulatory or a legal scheme that addresses that becomes much more complicated. It's also, this is both complicated and an opportunity, which is that there are a lot of farms, and politically they have a lot of power, but the reality is a very small number of them are these large monoculture, chemical dependent, energy intensive industrial operations that produce the vast majority of our food. And I would argue that we should be willing to treat those industrial scale operations like the industries they are under our environmental laws, and if we treat the other 90% of the facilities which don't produce much of our food and not worry about regulating them, we might have a political chance in doing so. And then lastly, the other reason this becomes complicated is our food is cheap and the farmers get almost nothing of what you pay. And I can promise you right now the world price of coffee is about $1 a pound. So when you buy a cup of coffee for $4, which in one cup of coffee is maybe you can make about 20 cups of coffee from a pound. So you've got about 5 cents of coffee in that cup of coffee that you're buying for $4, and the farmer is getting 5 cents of that. So it's a tough situation when you say, let's just try to get the farmer to do more, because right now they don't have the resources to do it, and the system doesn't give them the opportunity to do it. This is one last point. There's a little gizmo, a website you can play with called globalcalculator.net. And it's sort of addictive if you like this sort of thing. You can put in different interventions in terms of how clean is our energy, how efficient is our transportation, et cetera, and come up with different scenarios. So they have the usual business as usual scenario, and you can either put in really aggressive reductions on all the other sectors, but the world goes to eating as much meat as the US does, and this is sort of what you get. In other words, you're in trouble. If without the other reductions we go to high meat scenario, the world just goes to where US and Western Europe is, we're pretty much fried quickly. And if on the other hand you do nothing else but just change our diets, we come very close to reaching our targets. So the idea that we have this, unlike in many other sectors, this behavioral change that is so powerful and yet, of course, super hard to talk about, is again distinguishes agriculture from other sectors that we work on. The good news is that there are a lot of solutions here. Yeah.
For the less meat production, does that matter if the farms are like grass-fed or grazed versus CAFO lots?
To some extent, but ultimately not a lot. If you, and there's a lot of debate about this, et cetera. The bottom line is the vast majority of meat in this country is coming out of CAFOs, but The grass-fed, if it's done just right, has the opportunity to increase soil carbon. On the other hand, the cow takes longer to get to slaughter weight, and all that time is belching and farting and releasing methane. It will also differ whether the manure is handled dry or wet, et cetera. So there's a lot of nuances to that. But the bottom line is the cow, just by its very being, is producing a lot of methane. However, it's fed or maintained. So as I said, the good news is, and I probably spent too long talking about the bad news, is that there are a lot of alternatives. And when Nate and I wrote a long chapter that we put into an article and then going to change into a book on how to decarbonize agriculture, we had to spend a lot of time on this because this isn't as well understood yet as the idea of renewable energy, solar energy, efficient light bulbs that I'm sure all of you have read and heard a lot about and thought a lot about. But in fact, there are a number of practices that will significantly reduce not only the climate impact, but also the water quality impact of agricultural activities. They will also make these activities more resilient to floods and droughts and extreme weather. There was a study that came out by KPMG, not a radical group, that looked at each sector's income versus, or its revenues versus its external costs. And most sectors, the revenue was greater than the external cost. Agriculture was the only sector of the economy where the external costs were significantly greater, more than 2.5 times the income of the sector. So what you pay for food is a tiny fraction of what it really costs to produce that under this current model. This is just, I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly. They're really sort of fun to think about though. Just plant perennial crops. So if you get, for example, your protein more from nut crops, which are trees which have big root systems, a lot more roots. You can imagine these, in this case, each one, this is the annual and this is the perennial. There's a lot more root mass there, a lot more carbon, not just in the roots, but in the soil around that. And by the way, when there's a flood or a drought, you can imagine that this plant is going to do a lot better than this plant. And so similarly, some of these other ones, for example, managing the fertilizer, one that's getting a lot of venture capital attention now is putting a GPS and a lot of data into your tractor that applies fertilizer. It's not perfect. We're doing this on one of our farms, and you can reduce fertilizer use maybe 10, maybe 15%, and then also target it in different ways. So on the margin, it can make a difference. But the idea is to see how vigorous a plant is, largely by past data and also by, say, soil moisture in that area, and put fertilizer only in those plants that actually warrant it, as opposed to putting the same fertilizer in the whole huge field. And there's differences, and we found this too, literally whether it's applied 4 inches away, 2 inches away, right on, depending on what the weather is going to be in the next couple of days, all of these factors can make a significant difference in nitrous oxide emissions. No-till is a biggie. The bottom line is plants are carbon, and so the less you mess with the plants, the more carbon you're going to have. So using cover crops, which is to plant something so the ground is not bare in December, January, February, not only has the advantage of covering the crops and adding carbon, it also reduces pests and adds nutrients and fertilizer and essentially fertility to the soil, reducing fertilizer needs. And since fertilizer itself, synthetic fertilizer, is very energy intensive to create, any reduction in fertilizer has outsized carbon impacts or climate impacts. If you really want to address agriculture and climate, feel free to hug a tree. Trees in pastures are good. Trees around farms are good. And until relatively recently, until President Nixon, Secretary of Agriculture, really urged farmers to cut down all the trees, there used to be a lot more trees in the American landscape. And now actually with climate change, an interesting thing is adding trees into pasture land so cows have a place to shade themselves is becoming, that reason for planting the trees is becoming more powerful because a hot, sweaty cow loses a lot of weight. Weight is money for a rancher. So the trees now are literally a way to protect their investment in their cow's meat. And how you manage the cows, we can spend there's a lot of debate on this, can significantly change both the amount of soil in the carbon, but also the runoff in the streams. And if, for example, the 2018 Farm Bill that was just signed in December has some provisions that are good for climate change, even though in the 800-page bill the words climate change never appears. But because of the concern for protecting drinking water, led actually by an Ohio senator, I showed you pictures of Toledo's water supply earlier, the concern to protect drinking water leads to the same practices that would be good from a climate perspective. So these you can justify politically now and talk about urging practices, all of these ones we've talked about under a drinking water perspective, but they also have a significant climate impact. And right now, a lot of the manure in these concentrated animal feeding operations is basically held in big open lagoons. And when they are there are these big pools festering away, releasing tremendous amounts of methane and nitrous oxide. If you handle it dry, which you have to use it, it means you can't just spray everything and use water to move everything around. Just that difference can make a change how the bacteria operate and how the waste decomposes, significantly change the greenhouse gas emissions. You also don't annoy the neighbors as much this way. Which, if you're following the nuisance cases in North Carolina, there's been a number of nuisance cases brought by neighbors against CAFO's swine farms, swine facilities, and 5 out of 5 that have gone to verdict have led to plaintiff's verdicts, significant both compensatory and punitive damages. So not annoying the neighbors or poisoning them is not a bad thing. And there's a lot of other ones. Read our book if you want to read about them all. And that is just what's out there now. There's a lot of technology going on. It's sort of fun. I think it's sort of amazing, the idea that ag tech venture capital is now about the same as finance tech. Now, it's true that most of this is right now going into logistics rather than the actual agricultural part, but it's a growing field of sort of the high-tech guys they're mostly guys, I suppose, who want to be investing in and trying to use technology to reduce the impact of agriculture. And so if you add all this up, what's sort of amazing is that, and this is the analysis that we did, is you can actually get to carbon neutral agriculture. It's not the entire food system. There's a lot of the food system that is beyond that in addition to actual agriculture. But if agriculture particularly starts becoming negative, you could actually imagine getting to the place where we could get a lot of our food without a negative impact on the climate. We're nowhere close to that now, but it's really quite plausible. The trouble is, we're not there. Right now, all these good things that I've been talking about, even though they've been demonstrated all around the country, different crops, different regions, different scales, to be both effective from an environmental perspective and profitable for the farmer perspective, they're not used very much. Cover crops, which are widely understood to be beneficial in many ways, are still used on just a fraction of U.S. crops. No-till, which is probably the least effective of many of the measures, is the most widely used, and many of the others are used even less than 1%. So we have a lot of work to do to expand that. And what we go through, and this is where you guys come in as lawyers to be or law students, is the law really profoundly shapes what farmers do. The law in this country is partly the environmental laws, but very significantly the U.S. Farm Bill, which started during the Depression. Nate's written a couple great articles about it. It's renewed every 5 years, and in some ways has largely just gotten worse and worse for almost 100 years, encouraging a industrial, chemical dependent, monoculture, ever more consolidated industry. So while right now that hasn't been, it's had a lot of influence, which isn't necessarily good, that same law with some changes could make a big difference. And so you have the platform if it is used correctly. One piece of it is there's a tremendous amount, you've probably all heard of all the ag schools. The US has funded ag schools throughout the country. And they used to provide a lot more outreach to farmers. So farmers trying to figure out, like, I want to plant cover crops. What seeds do I use? What mixture of seeds is going to be the best for this soil, this region, and this crop that I grow the rest of the year? And do I plant it in October? Do I plant it in November? How do I plant it? A lot of questions that are quite real. And what's happened is the outreach that the government provides has been cut dramatically. So very often now, the farmer ends up asking the fertilizer salesman some of these questions. And the fertilizer salesman's questions may not always be the ones with the full breadth of the public interest in mind. So there's a lot of opportunity to take back, expand education and outreach and technical assistance, take back its public focus, and it could have a big impact. The good news, again, is in every county in the country, you've already got people out there. And many of them are good people. They, if given the right tools, they would really be assisting farmers making these shifts, in part because they also see farmers suffering from droughts and floods. So we have this great opportunity, largely untapped right now. There's also a lot of money. The Farm Bill provides a tremendous amount of money to farmers, billions of dollars of every year through a number of programs. And their own studies show that of the practices, for example, the EQUIP program, many of them are actually counterproductive. And so we have there, and that's NRCS, federal government data. So one of the things the new Farm Bill allows is, instead of the usual 75% cost share, to add, to sweeten it even more, a 90% cost share, which is really pretty significant for selected best practices. We're now in the advocacy stage of trying to make sure the states pick the right 10 practices to be giving this extra boost to. But again, think about this opportunity. Most times when you think you want to have an influence, you think, okay, maybe we'll get some federal funding to help something out. Where do we get the money? The government is strapped, et cetera. We're already paying a huge amount of money. We don't have to invent a new pot of money in this case. We have this enormous pot of money, and it flows through the Federal Natural Resources Conservation Service, through the state agents. We have a whole system for passing out this money. We just have to somewhat redirect it. So again, that's a huge opportunity that in most other areas we don't have. This pot of money just sitting there already. We have the Conservation Reserve Program, which essentially pays farmers not to farm on their land. You can imagine a program like that can do a lot of good, or depending on the choice of the land, what happens to the land after it's been taken out for 10 or 15 years. There's a lot of details there in terms of its potential impact. And again, that is there were some tweaks to that, again, focused on water quality, but with a big carbon impact in the most recent Farm Bill, to try to target this significant amount of money in a better way. When I talk to farmers in the Northeast and Massachusetts, well, I'll get to that in a second, they're often what they want is to get out of this problem of selling on the commodity market. And I can tell you as a coffee farmer, the world commodity market for coffee stinks. So what we've been trying to do with our own coffee is take it out of that. We try to make it specialty coffee with specialty preparations. We enter into long-term contracts with Nespresso and Caribou and Starbucks that are divorced from the ups and downs of the market. And that way we can sort of lock in. It may be a good price for us. It may be, maybe some freak chance we'll lose some super high market in a couple of years, but we're getting a decent long-term approach, and farmers really would like that stability. By and large, most agricultural products are not sold that way. They're really sold coming and going on the spot market, and that is a really tough way to do business. It's a really terrible way to do business. So simply changing some of the way marketing, like a city saying, okay, we'll enter into a long-term contract for product produced from farms that are using these practices, and we'll agree to buy a certain amount for the next 5 years. That's a huge change and an opportunity that folks in the city, for example, have to make a big difference in rural communities. And this can get a little wonky, but crop insurance is a big driver. It's largely federally funded. About 3/4 of it is subsidized by you, the taxpayer. But there's a lot of opportunities to change that, although politically challenging. But again, the point here that I want you to think about is we have this system in place which is already extensive and has the administrative mechanism, a huge amount of federal money goes into it. And although it's not easy to change, it's probably easier to change it than to create a whole new pot of money and a whole new system from scratch. And then lastly, some exciting work is going on at the state level, obviously given momentum by the change of the federal government, of the federal administration. But healthy soils is the term we use for climate-friendly farming that is more politically and broadly understood, but it's also quite real because these are healthier soils. There's a big effort going on in Massachusetts right now. I should have put Massachusetts at the top of this chart coming here. Sorry about that. But a Massachusetts Healthy Soils Bill is working its way through the legislature. There may actually be a hearing in May on the bill, and then it will work its way hopefully to a floor vote by the end of the summer. New Mexico, actually this is old, just 2 weeks ago actually passed and signed into law their healthy soil bill, so this should be above the line. We're working in New York pretty hard and some other places. But these are all states that are in one way or another saying, let's take all this federal money that flows through us and direct it preferentially towards these practices that will help our drinking water, help our farmers survive climate change impacts, and also help mitigate climate change. Let's use a little extra money. Let's use our purchasing power. Let's use our, ability to influence and talk about things. Let's give gold star awards to make people feel proud of what they're doing. All of these are opportunities that are happening at the state levels right now. And I think that is it. Yes, that's it. So thank you. I hope you